Hey guys, Paul Warburg back in Utah today. Been a while since I posted a video. I've been in Austin on a business trip, but I am happy to be back and excited to talk about a subtle but potentially very significant series of developments in the war in Ukraine. And in today's video, I also want to answer a question that maybe a lot of you haven't thought a lot about, which is why hasn't Ukraine just taken out Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers? The backdrop behind today's topic starts a couple of days ago when Ukraine launched their largest air assault yet of the entire war, where they sent a massive wave of drones and missiles against targets on Russian territory. And as we're used to seeing, a lot of these targets were military targets, of course, but also energy infrastructure targets, whittling down the little bit that remains of Russia's functional energy infrastructure. Now, this air assault is, of course, interesting, but it also sits within the broader context of air assaults that Ukraine had been making over the prior weeks leading up to this. And in those prior weeks, we also saw something very interesting from Ukraine that carried a lot of geopolitical signaling. Something that I've said in previous videos, that when Ukraine starts to do this, it shows potentially that they are ready to change some of their geopolitical strategy to help them win the war. And these targets that I'm talking about are oil and gas targets in and around specifically the Russian ports that Russia has been using to supply oil and gas to its shadow fleet of tankers that, of course, Russia is using to prop up its economy. Interestingly, what this showed was that Ukraine had the ability to directly target the facilities that actually take Russian oil and gas and put them on Russia's shadow fleet of tankers. But for now, Ukraine has decided not to directly target those facilities, but instead to target facilities around them within the same area of Russian airspace. And what this is doing is Ukraine is basically sending a signal that they could take out Russia's shadow fleet at any time, but currently they are choosing not to. And in this video, I want to examine why, because this actually has some much broader geopolitical implications around Europe, but especially around the United States as a new president takes office. Now, really quickly, guys, as we get into that, I first wanted to take a brief moment to share about the sponsor that made the research for today's episode possible. Sponsors allow me to spend more time focusing on researching and making these videos, and ultimately mean that I can produce much higher volume and higher quality content for you guys in the long run. The sponsor of today's video is Exter. And if you haven't heard about Exter, they create lots of really cool daily carry items, and they are especially well known for their wallets, like these ones. I personally love these wallets for a lot of reasons. They are super ergonomic, they fit right in the palm of your hands, and they are also just really well laid out with a spot for everything you need, from ID to cash. And they also have this really cool pop-out feature that's super satisfying every time, that makes it super easy to grab the specific card you need whenever you need it. Extra also has these super cool GPS finder cards that fit in your wallet just like a credit card and make it super easy to find your wallet if you lose it, or to send an audible ping to it if you're having trouble finding it when you're trying to leave the house. Right now is a great time to grab an Extra wallet because they are currently having their New Year's sale where you can get up to 40% off through January 22nd, which is a phenomenal deal. And you can also use my code Paul Warburg at checkout to unlock extra savings. Now let's get back to our discussion about Russia's shadow fleet. So for those who aren't familiar with Russia's shadow fleet and what it does, just very briefly, this is the fleet of tankers that Russia basically uses to avoid sanctions that have been placed on them by the United States and Europe. These are old, decrepit tankers that are not supposed to be running in international waters because it's not safe to do so, and they're basically impossible to insure. Where the Russian government has to take up the cost of insuring these tankers directly, And they're willing to do so because this is basically their only way to continue propping up their economy. Now, there's been a lot of talk throughout the war in Ukraine about the desperate need to stop this shadow fleet of tankers and completely cut off the Russian economy until the war is over. And a lot of people, particularly Russians, point to the existence of the shadow fleet as if it is a failure of the West to contain Russia. But I want to demonstrate in this video that that's not actually true, and that Ukraine itself not being willing to take out Russia's shadow fleet of tankers, even though they could, is just one piece of a much larger puzzle that gets more interesting the more you put it together. What I'm going to demonstrate throughout this video is that it doesn't actually benefit Ukraine or the broader world to completely cut off Russian energy from the global markets, at least not yet. That is a step that Ukraine could take, but there are a lot of strategic steps that they can take before they reach that decision. This in turn shows us that Ukraine is indeed playing the long game with Russia, despite the fact that most global analysts conclude that Russia has the advantage in a long war. And really, by analyzing and thinking through the facts in this video, we can challenge and indeed undermine a lot of assumptions that people make about the war in Ukraine. So let's start off with the idea that Ukraine does not want to and is not seeking to completely cut off Russian energy from the broader global market. Is there any evidence for that besides the fact that Ukraine has chosen not to target Russia's shadow fleet? And the answer to that is, of course, yes, because there are a lot of other areas where we see that Ukraine has portrayed strategic patience. Most notably, if we look at recent news and what I've created a couple of in-depth videos on, Ukraine recently made the decision, after 3 years of war against Russia, to stop allowing Russia to transfer natural gas through pipelines that pass over Ukrainian territory to reach other parts of Europe. And the question we have to ask is, why did Ukraine wait 3 years to make that decision, basically benefiting Russia in the short term? In that example, what we see is that Ukraine, beyond a shadow of a doubt, had the ability to stop flows of Russian energy from reaching European markets, and yet they chose not to. So there's 2 examples so far. Is there any other evidence to back up this theory? And it turns out, yes, there is. It turns out that right after Russia invaded Ukraine, the West pretty blatantly revealed their strategy towards Russian energy trade that, for whatever reason, a lot of people haven't looked into, that still causes them to miss key facts about Russia's shadow fleet today. And that is that when the West introduced sanctions on Russian oil, they did not introduce a ban on Russian oil in the way that they have introduced bans, or at least attempted to introduce bans, on nations like Iran. Instead, what they tried to do was introduce a price cap on Russian oil. The way the price cap works is that it actually makes it perfectly legal and actually acceptable under sanctions for certain nations to continue buying Russian oil. The caveat is that they just can't buy it for above a certain price. And the attempt here is to keep Russian energy on the market while reducing Russian profits, because the price cap is set at a level where it is barely worth it for Russia to continue its trade. Why would you take this particular approach? Well, there's a couple different reasons. One I've already implied: to keep the energy on the market. I'll explore that more in depth in just a second. Another is to benefit other nations at Russia's expense. And a third reason is to prevent Russia from completely destabilizing, because that could create a long-term crisis that is actually worse for the world than the war in Ukraine, and it could actually end up being more dangerous for Ukraine in the long term. So let's take each of those three pillars and look at them in a little bit more depth to also understand why Ukraine today isn't yet taking out Russia's shadow fleet. And let's start with keeping Russian energy on the market. There are a lot of reasons that the world needs to keep at least a portion of Russia's energy on the market, no matter how much we might not like that. And that is because the global trade system that we have is a delicately balanced system where you can't just turn off oil flows or energy flows overnight without creating humanitarian crises. Ukraine and the West wanted to give Russia time before their energy was completely taken off the market for the benefit of other nations. We see an example of this in Transnistria. I'm not going to go too deep into that right now because I have other videos on it, but where they had 3 years to prepare for the ending of Ukraine's contract with Russia to send gas over their territory, and they didn't prepare. And this is now creating a humanitarian crisis where people are basically being told not to leave their homes if they can help it, to stay with their families, huddle in one room so they don't freeze to death. And all their industry has also been shut down overnight. If that type of crisis were to take place on a broader scale across Europe or across the world, it would obviously be a problem. And this is part of the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place and thought they could get away with it, because they knew that they did hold this leverage over a big chunk of the world. It turns out the world was able to cut off a lot of Russian energy, but they needed to keep at least some Russian energy on the market, at least for a period of time. So that's one reason. Another reason why you need to keep Russian energy on the market actually comes back to, in the end, establishing strong support for Ukraine. It turns out, because the global market is so interconnected, if you remove one piece of its energy supplies, it affects everyone. Even, for example, the United States, where we produce more than enough oil and gas for our own consumption ourselves, and are actually net exporters of energy. Even though that's the case, if Russian energy were taken off the market, that would raise our energy prices, because the companies that harvest energy in the US want to make the maximum profit possible. When there is less supply globally, there is more demand globally, and that causes prices to go up, and you're going to sell to the most profitable buyer, which in the end is going to raise energy prices, even in places like the US that have enough of their own capacity. Now, we all know that in the United States, people don't pay that much attention to global politics. But one thing that everybody pays attention to in the United States is gas prices. For better or worse, higher gas prices almost always alienate American people against their presidents, and they start looking for a scapegoat. And so to completely remove Russian energy from the global market that would raise gas prices in the United States would have a very high likelihood of turning Ukraine into a scapegoat in the United States, even more so than we've already seen, even for invalid reasons. And so for Ukraine, there is a calculus here to where, yes, keeping Russian energy on the market allows Russia to continue funding its war, but the support that Ukraine gets from its Western partners is more valuable than the income that Russia gets from its oil industry. So Ukraine has to toe that line and constantly make a decision. Do we want to completely take out Russian energy and risk future and further Western support? So there's another reason that the energy stays on the market. Now, a second reason for the approach that's been taken to Russian energy, beyond just those two reasons for keeping Russian energy on the market, is that by keeping Russian energy on the market in the way that it's being kept on the market, it is benefiting other nations at Russia's expense, and in particular, India. India, of course, is a massive oil refining country. And a lot of people have been very upset that India is buying crude oil from Russia's shadow fleet and then shipping that oil up to Europe. And I understand why people are upset about that if they don't understand all the facts, and if they don't understand that this is actually the system that the European leaders were trying to create. But it turns out that this situation is a win-win-win for everybody involved, except for Russia. Under this arrangement, India, which is one of the world's poorest economies, especially given its massive population, gets to make a healthy profit by buying cheap Russian gas, refining it, and then sending the product up to Europe. That helps Europe in two ways. First, it reduces India's need for potential humanitarian support in the future by helping to develop India further. A win. Second, it also keeps the energy infrastructure in Europe intact without major changes in the short term. By doing things this way, Europe does not have to upset its economies and create potential political instability, and therefore Europe can focus more on supporting Ukraine in more impactful ways. Now, also because of this arrangement, when we see India growing in power, that helps the West because India is a good buffer against both Russia and China. I'll talk about it more in future videos, but India and China don't exactly get along. They have a lot of border disputes, and China is going to be pretty nervous about starting any major conflicts with the West, with a country the size of India right on its borders. Even though India isn't the world's greatest military superpower, if they were there alongside a war with the West, it makes the calculus almost implausible for China to try to do anything. And so by strengthening India, the West gets to help offset China in that way. And because India is part of BRICS, this economic alliance with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, India growing in prominence in BRICS helps undermine Russia's position in that organization and undermines Russian power in the long term while benefiting a nation that is more useful to be in the West corner. So there already are several strong reasons to keep Russian energy on the market, at least under certain circumstances, that benefit the West and ultimately Ukraine. And the final one is a more long-term kind of thinking, which is that by keeping a portion of Russian energy on the markets, it prevents Russia from destabilizing. And for Ukraine, this might actually be the most important thing. And this is a very strong argument against Russian propaganda, because Russian propaganda will always say that the West, and now Ukraine, wants Russia to completely destabilize. But the truth is, that couldn't be further from the truth. The West wants the Putin regime now to fall because it is evil and it is doing evil things. But a destabilized Russia creates a lot of problems for the world. And because Ukraine is right on Russia's border, if Russia destabilizes, that's a bad thing for them. So how does keeping Russian energy on the market prevent Russia from destabilizing? Well, it turns out that because Russia is so darn cold, they have a very serious problem that can take place with their energy infrastructure, which is where if they shut down their oil pipelines or their oil drills and therefore stop the flow into their oil pipelines, those pipelines can freeze up. And in many cases, these are thousands of kilometers of pipelines. Once those wells stop and those pipelines freeze up, basically the entire pipeline has to be replaced. And because oil and gas make up such a huge portion of Russia's income, this would devastate the country, which is already very, very poor. Now, when we look at nations around the world that are very poor with no income opportunities, while you might be tempted to push somebody into this situation for short-term reasons like the war in Ukraine, in the long term, we know that these are the regions of the world that create instability. They are breeding grounds for resentment. They are breeding grounds for terrorism. And so the West and Ukraine don't want this to happen to Russia, if they can at all help it. It is sort of a last-ditch type of resort. So Ukraine here has to play a balancing act. They do not want Russian energy infrastructure to shut off completely to the point that it's going to destabilize Russia after the war is over. But they do want to reduce Russian energy profits as much as possible and perhaps shut down portions of the Russian energy infrastructure without creating a series of events that will cause the entire system to collapse. That is why you will see Ukraine targeting Russian energy infrastructure, particularly refineries and other facilities like that. But they have not yet targeted the head of the snake, which is the actual place where the oil and gas is loaded onto Russia's shadow fleet of tankers. Because that could completely stop Russian supplies to the outside world and cause an uncontrollable chain reaction. Now, to this point, the fact that Ukraine has shown this much restraint shows that they are not as desperate as a lot of people make them seem. And it shows that they are not as afraid of a long-term war as a lot of people make it seem. They have calculated that they are still able to continue fighting for some time under the current circumstances. That being said, if the circumstances change, you could see potentially Ukraine's strategy towards this changing as well. So for example, if the United States decides to stop supporting Ukraine for any reason, Ukraine might decide it is more worth it for them to target Russia's shadow fleet than not. Now that, in turn, because of rising oil prices that would then ensue, and what that would do to the broader global economy, could actually end up costing the United States more than even just directly financially supporting Ukraine would. So the United States needs to think really carefully about the actions that it chooses to take next. And it needs to think through things strategically from a long-term cause and effect perspective, rather than let's just try this and see what happens. Because if we try something and it creates an impact that we didn't anticipate, which it almost certainly would, we might really regret that. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I hope it was informative. Before I close, can I ask a quick favor? If you enjoyed this video, if you thought it was informative or important, or even if you just found it interesting and you want to see more videos like it more frequently, would you consider becoming a patron and supporting this channel? It's completely voluntary. I don't plan on putting anything behind a paywall, but this is just a way for people who want to support the channel to do so if they so choose. If you want to learn more about that, just follow the QR code on screen or click the link in the description. Also, don't forget to check out Exter. Their 40% off sale is going to end really soon. With that in mind, thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.